Welcome everyone back. Good afternoon. This is the fourth session of Mishnah in-depth Hullin with Rabbi Avie Walfish. It's been a pleasure to learn with him these past few weeks. This class is part of the Rifka Rosenwein Mishnah Division of Drisha and is sponsored in her memory by her family. And with that, the hour is short. I will pass over the mic to him.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you, Kayla. Sources are up. I wanted to open this evening or afternoon, depending where you are, with the last Mishnah in chapter 5, which will give us a kind of perspective on chapter 5 and give us a good segue into chapter 6. Okay, so here's the text of the Mishnah up on the screen. Yom echad amur bo tovet beno hayom holech achar halayla. Okay, so the last topic we discussed was in chapter 5. The topic is otovet beno, not to slaughter an animal and its offspring both together on the same day, both on the same day. So we discussed several of the important points about that in the Mishnah last time. We did not get to the last Mishnah, which tells us that there's some question about the definition of the day. Definition of the day is the day follows the night, meaning the day starts at night. Okay, and then Edzo Darash Rabbi Shimon ben Zoma, okay, one of the sages in Yavne. He's the one who taught this halacha and based it on the pasuk. Ne'amar b'masei Reshit Yom Echad, v'ne'amar botovet beno Yom Echad. Since the same phrase Yom Echad appears on the first day of creation and in the mitzvah of otovet beno. Conclusion: Ma yom echad hamur b'masei v'reshit hayom holech achar halayla, af yom echad hamur b'otovet beno hayom holech achar halayla. So, in the first day of creation, the understanding of the pasuk Vayerev Vayivoker Yom Echad is the day began in the evening and continued into the morning, and then Yom Echad, at the conclusion of the daylight hours, that was the end of the day. There is some question whether that's in fact the correct reading of the pasuk. That's the reading, obviously, we have in the Mishnah. That's the reading generally followed by Chazal and by the vast majority of commentators. Famously, Rashbam understands the pasuk differently. He understands that after the first day of creation, it was evening, God rested, and then as morning dawned, the first day ended. Okay, which would mean then that the day is first day, then night. Okay, but as I say, that's not the usually accepted interpretation, and certainly not Ben Zoma's interpretation. And following the classic interpretation that the day follows the night, so that Shabbat starts Friday night, not Saturday morning. Okay, Chagim start the nighttime, not in the morning, and many, many other halachot that reflect this idea that the night is the beginning of the 24-hour day. So that is applicable to to Otovet Beno as well. Now, the big question mark here is, why is that a question? We could have a Mishnah like this in many, many other places. Okay, it doesn't always say Yom Echad, so you can't have this drasha of Rabbi Shimon ben Zoma in all of these places. But in all kinds of areas of halacha, it's simply assumed that the day follows the night. Okay, why even call it into question so that we would need this special, this limud is called the Gzerah Shava, okay, where the same phrase appears in two different psukim. Why do we need that special drasha? So the Talmud raises this question. Okay, here's the passage, the Talmudic passage on this Mishnah brings a baraita. Tanu Rabbanan edzo darash Rabbi Shimon ben Zomal if he shekol ha'inyan kulo heino medaber ela bekodshim uvekodshim laila olech achar hayom yachol avzeh kein. Because, and here I'm going to refer back to something we spent some time on last week, and that is the pasuk of Otov et Beno is sandwiched between two psukim that talk about laws of kodshim. First law is Shivat Yamim Yeh Tachat Imo Uvayom Hashmini Titno Li. You can't accept an animal as a newborn animal as a sacrifice until it has reached its 8th day. Okay, for at least 7 days, the animal has to be with its mother. Okay, and then an additional pasuk talking about korbanot. So since this pasuk is sandwiched in between psukim related to korbanot, one might have thought that the law of Otov et Beno also follows the standard of korbanot. And in korbanot, the principle is that halayla holech achar hayom. Okay, this is his language. Bekodshim laila holech achar hayom. Rashi brings a source for this from the psukim, but anyone who follows the laws of the sacrifices will understand this. Okay, you offer a sacrifice during the day, you then eat it the following night. Okay, some sacrifices can be eaten the following day as well, but many sacrifices can be eaten only the night following the day. And the burning of the parts on the altar takes place the following night. So the night in the Mikdash follows the day. So we have this interesting phenomenon in halacha that the secular day, okay, or even the days of sanctified time, okay, are days where the day follows the night. Notice the day starts in the nighttime. But in the Mikdash, it follows the reverse pattern. First the day, then the night. Okay, I mean, we can conceptualize it as two different ways of relating to the rhythm of day and night. Okay, is the nighttime preparation for the next day. Okay, we sleep in order to prepare ourselves for the next day. Okay, so the nighttime is a time of entering into the framework of the next day, or we are resting up from the previous day. Okay, no, it's first you have the activity, and then you have a time of rest. Okay, so the rest concludes what you did the previous day, and apparently the Mikdash follows one pattern, and our normal everyday lives outside of the Mikdash follow the other pattern. Okay, so the issue is Otov et Beno primarily a law of kodshim that has been extended to include the food that the animals that we slaughter for our own consumption, but it's essentially like slaughtering. Slaughtering, we saw, okay, the first several prakim of Hullin are all about the laws of shchita, and shchita essentially is a law of kodshim that was extended to include the meat that we slaughter for our own secular consumption. So maybe Otovet Beno follows a similar pattern. And the answer of our Mishnah, and we see that Ben Zoma is the source of this answer, is that no, it's actually a law that applies to slaughtering animals for any purpose whatsoever. And as the beginning of the chapter noted, it applies both to secular animals and to sacrificial animals. It applies to both of them. Okay, but it originates within a Maaseh Breshit framework. It originates within the framework of the world that we inhabit. Within that world that we inhabit, we follow the day that we follow in most areas of our life, which, as far as halakha is concerned, means you start at night and the daytime completes, okay? Completes the day that began the previous night. And that is how we define Otovet Beno as well. So this is most decidedly not a sacrificial law extended to the secular realm, but rather a secular law that applies in the sacrificial realm the same way it applies in the secular realm. Okay, that concludes that chapter, and we move on to chapter 6. Chapter 6, Perek Shishi, opens with Kisui Hadam Noheg Ba'aretz Uvechutz La'aretz Bifnei Habayit V'shelo Bifnei Habayit B'chulin Avalo B'muktashin V'noheg B'chaya Uva'of B'mezuman Uv'sheino mezuman. Okay, the covering of the blood applies in Eretz Israel and outside of Eretz Israel, in when there is a temple and when there is no temple, regarding chulin, secular foods, avaloba muktashin, okay, but it does not apply to sanctified animals, to sacrificial animals, and it applies to wild animals and fowl, but okay, and it applies regardless of whether the animal is available or unavailable, meaning an animal that is under human control, okay, or an animal that's still out in the wild, and a human being will be able to make use of it only if he first captures it from out in the wild. Okay, now you'll note that I, bolded this and gave it a color coding. Any idea why?
I imagine it parallels something else.
Very good. Okay, excellent guess. Okay, any idea what it might be paralleling?
Other things that were noheg b'chutz and noheg b'bayit.
That's right, such as?
Shchita, or what we were just talking about, the other thing.
Otovet Beno.
Right.
Okay, good. Second guess is on target. Okay. But not only that, look at the opening of chapter 7. Gid hanasheh noheg ba'aretz uv'chutz la'aretz b'fnei habayit v'shelo b'fnei habayit b'chulin uva muktashin. This now applies, yes, to muktashin. Noheg b'behema uv'chaya. Okay, and applies both to domestic animals, behema, and to chaya, wild animals. Okay, they know noheg ba'of, but it does not apply to fowl
Because it doesn't have one.
Okay,
It doesn't have one.
Okay, because it doesn't have the right shape of leg. Okay, because the
doesn't have that hip
law
joint.
of Yid Hanasheh is kaf hayarech. Okay, it has to have a thigh shape. Okay, with the and birds' legs don't have that shape, and so that law is inapplicable to them. So here we have a a chart that shows us the chapter openings of chapters 5, 6, which is the chapter we're focusing on now, and 7. Otovet Beno in chapter 5, Kisui Adam in chapter 6, Gid Hanasheh in chapter 7. And in all three areas, Noheg Ba'aretz Uv'chutz La'aretz Bifnei Habayit V'shelo Bifnei Habayit. Because all these three laws apply equally in Israel or out, with a temple, without a temple. B'chulin uv'mukdashin in the case of Otovet Beno and Gid Hanasheh. But odd man out here is Kisui Adam. It applies to Chulin and not to Muktashin. Any idea why Kisui Adam is the odd man out? Why
Yeah,
is
because
that inapplicable to sacrificial animals?
because you sprinkle the blood. You use the blood.
Because there's something you're supposed to do with the blood, sacrificial animals. The key, avodah. Okay, anyone who was with me for Tractates Vachim
Right.
talked about this at length, that in
You
especially
poured it
in,
on the Mizbeach.
right, especially in the rabbinic conception of korbanot, the sprinkling of the blood is the key avodah, the key form of service. Okay, in the Torah, it's also an important form of service, not necessarily the main one, but in rabbinic literature, it gets promoted. Okay, at the top of the heap as far as sacrificial procedures are concerned. But one way or the other, okay, the blood of sacrificial animals is not allowed to pour onto the ground and then covered over. On the contrary, supposed to receive the blood and then sprinkle it on the Mizbeach, or in some occasions, sprinkle it inside the sanctuary.
Parochet.
Right, the parochet, or even the kaporet on Yom Kippur. It's even be towards the
Aron.
kaporet. Okay, so kaporet, parochet, the Mizbach HaZahav, all of them are involved in that. Okay, so that's why Kisui Adam diverges from the other two. This is one of the main purposes of parallelism. And the Mishnah creates this kind of parallelism so that it can often be all kinds of more subtle and more sophisticated messages, and we'll talk about some of that further on. But on the simplest level, when the Mishnah creates this kind of a parallelism, it really helps you to map out, how these halachot, okay, interact. In what ways are they similar, and where does one diverge from the other? So in terms of Bachulinu v'muktashin, both Otovet Beno and Gid Hanasheh, that's standard. It applies to secular animals, and it applies equally to sacrificial animals. Kisui Adam diverges, and for a very good reason. Okay, we don't have to think hard to come up with the reason. Sometimes you have to work a little harder. Okay, but in any event, the parallelism really helps you to pinpoint where they're similar, where they're moving on parallel tracks, and where they diverge from one another. And now, at this point, chapter 5 ends its opening statement, and chapters 6 and 7 continue. Chapter 6, V'noheg b'chaya uva'of. We'll see what the rationale for that is a bit further on. Okay, it applies to wild animals and to fowl, but apparently not to domestic animals. Tovet Beno, we have no such restriction. Tovet Beno would apply to all animals, even though the Mishnah doesn't spell it out, but that's clear. And b'mizuman u'v'sheno mizuman is actually looking ahead to chapter 12. Okay, so I won't be learning chapter 12 with you. So I hope whoever takes over from me and learns chapter 12 will look back at this chapter opening of chapter 6 to see why. Chapter 12 talks about shiluach hakan. Okay, it talks about sending away the mother bird before you take her offspring. And that, the Mishnah will tell us, applies only to mizuman. That applies only to birds that are already under human control. But a bird that you encounter out in the wild, there is no mitzvah of shiluach hakan. Unlike that, however, kisui adam applies to any bird, whether the bird was in a dovecote in your backyard, or whether the bird was nesting somewhere out in the wild and I encountered it and decided to take the eggs or the chicks, fledglings, whichever way. As far as Kisui Adam is concerned, if I slaughter one of those birds, I then have to cover its blood. And
Excuse
actually,
me.
yes,
So how does one do the mitzvah of shiluach hakan today? No, I mean, very few people raise birds.
yeah.
Uh,
Okay, so the short answer is so you don't.
well,
If you don't happen to encounter it, so you don't fulfill it. In other words, and
No,
in
but
fact,
even if you encounter it, you're not raising it. You said if you find it in the wild,
that's
you
right.
don't do the mitzvah. So if you find it, let's say on your windowsill, you weren't raising it. It just happened to, nest there.
Well, if it's on your windowsill, then it's already, in your purview. It's already like within your territory.
yeah,
Okay.
like
The basic point is that it's in your territory.
just
Okay.
anecdotally, I
So
know
if you
people
take
who
it from
have,
your windowsill, probably the mitzvah would be applicable. Okay. But since that's in chapter 12, I'm going to let my successor deal with that, and we have enough to discuss in the chapters we have before us here, which are chapters 6 and 7. Okay, and now if we move on to Gid Anasheh, it doesn't apply to birds, but it does apply to all animals, including domestic animals and wild animals. And in that sense, it seems to be more similar to Otovet Beno, even though the Mishnah doesn't highlight that feature of Otovet Beno. Okay, so we see then this cluster of 3 chapters which open in similar fashion. Okay, now what's really fascinating in Tractate Hullin is that here we have a cluster of 3 chapters with this opening, and then at the end of the tractate, there are an additional 3 chapters that open in very similar fashion, for a total of 6 out of 12 chapters that open by highlighting that these mitzvot apply both in Eretz Yisrael and in Chutz La'aretz, before, where there is a temple, where there is no temple. Chulin and Muktashin, well, that varies depending on which law you're talking about and other details as well. But the basic, kernel of the idea, the nucleus is that they all apply regardless of whether there's a temple or not, regardless of whether you're in Israel or not. Okay, which basically is a major dominant theme in Tractate Hullin. We already discussed it in connection with Otovet Beno last week as well as this evening, that Tractate Hullin is very much about the interplay between Chulin and Kodshim. Chulin, in some respects, intersects Kodshim in either direction. Either laws of Kodshim are extended to include Chulin, or vice versa, as in Otovet Beno, that the law of Chulin is applicable to Kodshim. Okay? probably Gid Anasheh, we'd say something similar. Okay, so in certain areas they intersect, and in certain areas they diverge. For example, Kisui Adam. Kisui Adam, Hullin is very different from Kodshim. Okay, this, by the way, those who have been with me in previous classes may remember that we saw in chapter 2, you don't have to gather the blood when you slaughter. Okay, the blood can basically run off anywhere except for certain kinds of circumstances where it might appear to be like an idolatrous practice. So then sometimes you have to be wary of where the blood goes. But other than that, we don't really care about the blood. The language of the Torah is al haaretz tishbechenu kamayim.
Kamayim. Right.
Okay, let it pour out like water. That's the blood. There's one thing about the blood: don't eat it. We're not allowed to consume the blood. Ki adam hu nefesh. Okay, since the blood is the soul, v'ani netativ lachem al hamizbeach, and God wants the blood of sacrificial animals to be put on the altar. So for secular animals, just leave the blood alone. Don't touch it. Okay? Don't bother with it. Okay? Let it disappear and don't try to get any, don't try to consume it in any way. Okay, so that's a major area where not only in chapter 6, but as we saw back in chapter 2 as well, where the laws of Hullin and Kodshim diverge. But what these 3 chapters, as well as the 3 chapters, the end of the tractate, one of which, Bezrat Hashem, we'll be learning together next week, they really highlight this point, that Tractate Hullin is very much inviting us to make these comparisons, to see where Hullin and Kodshim intersect and where they diverge. And here, these 3 chapters, I think, give us a very fine view of how these comparisons can work.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Excuse my ignorance. I'm confused right now. Which blood do we pour like water on the ground? We're covering up the blood. We're sprinkling it on the kachin. That's when it's a korban. We are covering the blood of what? And we are pouring what?
Okay. So the answer is right here in the Mishnah.
I see that.
Okay. The wild animals and the fowl have the law of kisui adam. So you don't just ignore the blood. When the Torah says in the book of Dvarim, Parshat Re'eh, al haaretz tishbechenu kamayim, what it means is just let it run off. Don't bother with it.
Right.
Okay? But you don't have to collect it. You don't have to do anything with it. Just same as with water. With water, I can pour out water on the ground and
that's from what
doesn't
animal?
bother anybody.
From what animal?
That's from domestic animals.
Like a cow.
Like a cow, a sheep, a goat.
Okay. And when do I have to cover it?
When it's a wild animal, okay? A deer, okay? A deer, a gazelle, okay?
A ram?
No. You're
A ram is
a yal,
domesticated.
which is actually a deer. A ram is an ayil, which is an adult male sheep.
Uh-huh.
An adult male sheep is a domestic animal.
I
You have
see.
to differentiate between ayil and eyal. Okay, the examples the Torah gives of the wild animals are tzviv ayal. Okay, so tzviv ayal are gazelle and deer.
I see.
Okay, so but ayal is not the same as ayil. Ayil is a ram, which is a domestic animal.
I see.
Okay,
Okay.
and in one place in Parshat Rei, the Torah gives a lengthier list of wild
Right.
kosher animals. A re'em, a ta'o. Okay, it's like a buffalo.
Like an
Re'em, I
ibex.
don't know how to translate it, but you can see it in the biblical zoo with the big horns.
Right. The ibex and stuff. That would be the ones that you spill like water.
That no, those would be the ones that you would cover. The wild animals are
Oh.
the ones you
Uh,
cover.
okay. Okay.
Okay, the cow, the sheep, the goat. Okay, those would be the ones you just don't bother with the blood. Okay, that's what the Mishnah is telling us, and that's in fact what emerges from the pasuk. Okay, this is all based on Vayikra chapter 17. Bish ish mi bnei Israel min ager agar betocham asher yatzud tzeid chayao o of asher yeachel. Notice asher yatzud. Okay, same word that we encounter in this coming week's Parshat Shavua.
Ish
Esav was
Sayed.
a Yodei Tzayid Ish Sadeh.
Right.
Okay, he went out to the field, which means to the wild, in order to trap animals. That's tzayid. Okay, so the animals that you have to go out to the wild and trap, those animals and birds we don't differentiate, okay, between domestic birds and non-domestic birds, right? Bimzuman v'uveshe'eno mizuman. Okay, so here we don't make that differentiation between the domestic and wild birds. V'shafach et damo. Here also you pour out the blood, but v'chisahu be'afar. Okay, so for the animals, the domestic animals, you just pour out the blood and ignore it. Pour out the blood, because you're not supposed to consume the blood. So make sure to drain out as much of the blood as possible before you consume the meat. Okay, and that's why we have the whole
The
kosher
salting.
process,
Right. The
salting
salting.
it or boiling it, roasting it, whatever is involved in the koshering process. That's all you have to do. And what happens to the blood doesn't matter. Okay, as long as we don't consume it. But here, v'shavach et damo v'chisahu be'afar ki nefesh kol basar damo v'nafshohu, because that's where the soul of the animal resides, in the blood. V'omar livnei Israel dam kol basar lo tochelu ki nefesh kol basar damahu damo hi kol ochlav yikareh. Now, the puzzling feature here is, if the rationale for covering the blood is that the blood represents the soul of the animal, so then why is this law this halakha limited to non-domestic animals and to
Right.
birds? Why doesn't it apply to domestic animals? So that's one aspect of the bigger question, which is, what is this law all about? Why are we covering the blood? What might that represent? Okay, so I brought a few. Okay, I brought a few. Just a second. Where are we? So I brought a few explanations for that. Do I not have it here? I thought I had more explanations. Okay, we'll make do with this. Okay, so first let's start with the question of why we differentiate between the domestic animals and the wild animals. So I brought here from Midrash Yilamdenu. If you slaughter an ox, sheep, or goat, do not cover their blood. Why? Because they stem from your possession and are under your authority. But those that are under his, i.e. God's authority, if you slaughter them, cover their blood. Why? Lest he become your prosecutor and slayer. Okay, so what's the basic differentiation between domestic animals and fowl and non-domestic animals, on the other hand? They are not under our authority.
Your authority.
Okay, this explanation really is very reminiscent of how Ramban explains the permission to eat meat in the first place. Okay, remember, some commentators read this a little differently, but the simple reading of the book of Breshit indicates that Adam Arishon was not allowed
Was a
to eat meat.
vegetarian.
He was supposed to eat only vegetation, and permission to eat meat was granted to Noah. Why? So one explanation we'll see in the next passage, but the explanation of Ramban is that all the animals that emerged from the ark owed their very existence to Noah. Noah was the one who brought them onto the ark. Noah was the one who cared for them and tended to them while they were on the ark. Okay, there are midrashim about how he was busy 24/7 with the animals. He had, during the day, he had to feed the daytime animals. At night, he had to feed the nighttime animals. Okay, so he was busy the whole time. And so he took possession of them. Since they were beholden to him for their very existence, God said, now I grant you the ability and the permission to consume them for food. Okay, and what this midrash is doing is sort of fine-tuning that notion and saying today, domestic animals that are under our control and authority, okay, that are dependent upon us, okay, so when we slaughter them for food, okay, that's our prerogative. That's part of our ownership and control. They're dependent upon us, and so we can decide when to terminate their lives in order to consume them. But the animals that are out in the wild, and fowl, by definition, are never considered to be fully under our control, okay? Because they're not terrestrial animals. They're animals that fly, okay? So even if we manage to control them to an extent, they're never fully under our control. So therefore, when we slaughter them, okay, so we're committing a kind of act of violence. And so the Torah, on the one hand, is allowing us to do it, but when we do it, we have to cover their blood. Okay, we do it and then we cover their blood and, sort of hide the evidence. Okay, now that paradox seems a bit strange, but this is where Rav Kook picks up. Okay, it's actually a collection of his writings. Most of Rav Kook's writings were not works that he authored, but were collections that were culled from various things that he had written, and many of them from his notebooks. Today we have his notebooks, and we can see the original, and sometimes we can see where there were editorial changes or significant editorial changes or even censorship of some of Rav Kook's ideas by his disciples. Okay, and one of these collections is called Chazon HaTzimchonut. Rav Kook himself was a vegetarian except for Shabbat. Shabbat, he used to eat a minimal amount of meat because he felt that was the mitzvah of Oneg Shabbat. You had to have at least a small amount of meat. Other than that, he was vegetarian the whole rest of the week. And he saw vegetarianism as an ideal to which humanity needs to strive. And so this work, Chazon HaTzimchonut, presents this vision. Okay, and as part of this essay, he talks about this mitzvah of Kisui Adam. Kisui Adam, Achayav Ha'of, Hi Kemo Mecha'a Elohit. By commanding us to cover the blood, it's like a divine protest. L'umat ha'eter ha'talui bisodo b'matzav ha'nefesh ha'mukulkelet shel Adam, ki yetzer lev ha'adam ra minu'urav. This pasuk that Rav Kook is quoting, Yetzer lev ha'adam ra minu'urav, anyone recognize the quote? Where is it from?
It's after Noah. It's after the
That's
Mabul.
right. It's from Parashat Noach. Okay, when God smells the fragrant sacrifices and says, I will not again destroy
Destroy the world.
mankind
Right.
because his inclination is evil. That, by the way, is exactly why he destroyed man, because his evil and inclination was so rampant, was so ubiquitous. So that's why God destroyed man and the world. And then after the flood, he decides, since man has this innate evil in his nature, I have to be more tolerant of him.
Because it's not going
I'll
to help
just have
if I
to
keep
tolerate
destroying.
a lot of garbage from this man with his evil inclinations. And Rav Kook said, and that's precisely why God allowed man to eat meat. Okay, and the idea seems to be, if man can't take out his aggressions on the animals, what he'll end up doing is
Take it out on
taking out his
people.
aggressions on his fellow man. And so God made a concession to man's moral weakness by saying, okay, eat meat. Okay, I know you have to have an outlet for this inclination, for this, responsiveness to blood, okay, for this need to somehow strike out, do violent things. This is your outlet. So it's a concession to human nature. However, God granted us that concession, but at least from Yisrael, he bounded that concession by saying, I protest. I'm signing the contract, but under duress. Okay, so I'm putting in, that this is with a protest. Yes, I'm signing it, but I protest. So God says, I'll let you do it, but here's my protest. I want you to cover the blood. Okay, and again, why only the blood of these creatures? So he gives a very similar explanation. If you jump down to the bottom lines, okay, the third line from the bottom at the end of the line, shall kol panim mitparneset miad ba'aleha ein ha'adam adayin ra'ui afilu latchil ba koach shel hakarat tzel shel busha. The idea is, Rav Kook had a very evolutionary philosophy, and part of his evolutionary philosophy was many mitzvot in the Torah are to educate man towards something that he's not capable of yet. And these mitzvot, and he lists here the mitzvah of slaughtering. We have to slaughter the animal in the most humane way possible. We have to avoid slaughtering oto ve'et beno, and several other mitzvot, all of which are designed to temper that instinct,
Urge.
that violent urge and instinct. The Torah tries to tone it down, and that's the Torah's way of educating us to something better, which we're not ready for yet. Rav Kook says, one thing we're not ready for yet is to feel any shame in slaughtering domestic animals. We slaughter domestic animals, and we feel we're entitled to do that. We supported them, we tended to them, so we can take their lives in order to consume their flesh. But at least regarding those animals that are not under our purview, regarding those animals and fowl, we can slaughter them and eat them because that's the divine concession, but at least show a sign of shame. Show that we feel there's something wrong with what we're doing. So that's why we have the law of Kisui Hadam. Now, one of the points that emerges from this discussion is that the connection between Otovet Beno and Kisui Hadam emerges very starkly here, right? Otovet Beno and Kisui Hadam grow out of the same motivation, and indeed, according to Rav Kook, the laws of slaughtering have a similar motivation. We're supposed to slaughter in as humane a fashion as possible. So all of these laws that are the core of Tractate Hullin are laws that really stem from a common core. Okay, and
Excuse me, would he say the same for Ir Miklat?
very likely. Very likely. I mean, the idea there are many areas of halacha where he might say the same thing. Let's take the laws of the captive woman in battle, right?
Kitetse,
Eshet
Eshet
Yifat
Jefat Torah.
Toa,
Right,
right? Or the laws of slavery
right.
could be
Because
presented.
we're not there
There are
yet.
many areas of halacha which can be analyzed along these lines. And Rav Kook notes in the course of this conversation that the laws of slaughtering grow out of kodshim. In other words, part of what we're doing is trying to sanctify. We're eating meat, but we sanctify it. But part of the sanctity, according to Rav Kook, is
Is the way you
to
kill it.
try to humanize it, to try to temper the violence of it, to try to introduce elements of compassion,
Kedusha, right.
of respect for other life. And the more we introduce those, the more we sanctify it, and the more that our consumption of meat can be in a way similar to the
Elevated.
sacrificial procedures, okay, which are also supposed to ennoble us, elevate us. Okay. Okay, we won't have much time to look at this in depth, but I noted that in Hullin chapter 5, that's Otovet Beno, and Hullin chapter 6, you have a discussion that is very, very similar. Okay? Hashochet v'nimtzat trefa, shochet lavodah zara, on both sides. And the question is, Rabbi Meir mechayev v'chachamim potrim, or Rabbi Shimon poter v'chachamim mechayevim, hashochet v'nitnal b'la v'yado. Chapter 6, which is about Kisui Adam, in the third, in the third row here on the right, says v'chein linyan otovet beno. It's an explicit comparison. So these mishnayot are clearly comparing the two. The topic, we won't be able to analyze what the Mishnah says about the topic, but we'll just note what the topic is. When you slaughter and the animal doesn't become permissible to be eaten. Okay? Some kind of impropriety in the slaughtering, that on the one hand, it's considered to be slaughtering, and on the other hand, it doesn't permit you to eat. And so the sages, Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Shimon, the Chachamim, have a dispute. Do these laws apply? Do the laws of Otovet Beno and Kisui Adam apply only to slaughtering that permits the animal for consumption, or even for slaughtering that in the end does not permit the animal for consumption? Okay, and so here's one of the ways in which the Mishnah indicates to us that Otovet Beno and Kisui Adam are really twin concepts. They really belong together, not just the common opening as we saw here, but also this very elaborate parallel between the two. Now the Mishnah also presents them a little differently, but we can't go into that. We won't have time. Won't have time for that. And one other place where chapter 6 is comparable to the laws of Kodshim. Two almost identical mishnayot in Zvachim and here in Hullin chapter 6 about what happens when the blood gets mixed in with something else, with water. So it's blood as long as it looks like blood. If it loses the appearance of blood, it's the water doesn't even turn pink. Okay, the water is, looks maybe like a little slightly murky water. So then it's no longer blood. So that's applicable to the tossing of the blood in the sacrifices and to the covering of the blood here, which I think again underscores that the covering of the blood is patterned on the tossing of the blood. The tossing of the blood is to give it back to God. The covering of the blood is, as Rav Kook says, okay, perhaps just to express our shame. But let's take a look at the last Mishnah in the chapter, and we'll see perhaps a suggestion of a different way of looking at it. Okay, b'ma mechasim uv'ma ein mechasim. What can you use to cover it? So the answer is, we'll just look at the bottom line of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, davar shu megadel tzmachim mechasin bo. Sheino megadel tzmachim ein mechasin bo. You have to cover it with something that you can use as soil, okay, for that plants can grow in. In other words, when you're covering the blood, I think it goes beyond what Rav Kook said. You're not just expressing your shame. You're returning the blood to nature, and you're using the blood as a way of fertilizing the ground, as a way of producing new life. In other words, I took a life, let me use the blood to produce
give back.
additional life. Okay, and let's remember, the animals that I slaughtered are herbivorous. Carnivorous animals are never kosher. So the animal that I slaughtered is certainly herbivorous. So the life that I produce can eventually feed other animals. Okay, so I think that's an additional idea in Kisui Adam that emerges from the Mishnah. Okay, we have a few minutes left to say a few words about chapter 7. We already talked about the opening of chapter 7, but now we need to talk about what is this mitzvah of Gid HaNasheh all about. Okay, so let's look at the psukim here. Psukim here, of course, are in the book of Breshit. Okay, after Yaakov wrestles with the angel, at the end of the wrestling match, the angel touches, that's the exact word, okay, touches Jacob's thigh, and the thigh is somehow dislocated. Okay, Nasheh means dislocated, moved out of place. So just by touching the thigh, he dislocated it. He is, after all, an angel. And then, okay, the sun shone, and Yaakov is limping on his thigh. Al kain lo yochlu b'nei Israel et gid hanasheh asher al kaf hayarech ad hayom hazeh ki naga b'chaf yerech Yaakov b'gid hanasheh. Therefore, the Israelites will not eat the gid hanasheh, the sciatic nerve, okay, which is on the cup of the thigh, okay, the curve of the thigh, until this very day, because he touched that part of Yaakov's thigh, okay, at the sciatic nerve, and thereby crippled Yaakov. So why do we commemorate that event by not eating the Gid HaNasheh? Okay, that's the question. So I brought several answers here. Rashbam,
Because
who
his name was
says,
changed.
as a commemoration of Jacob's heroism in standing his ground against this very powerful adversary. Okay, and there was a miracle. Okay, Yaakov calls the place Pnuel because he says, I saw a God or something divine, face to face, and I was saved. Yaakov emerged on his feet, limping, but on his feet from this encounter with the angel. Okay, so this is a form of celebration. Chizkuni, very interestingly, says that this is actually a badge of shame for not Jacob, but Jacob's sons. Why did they leave him alone? Why didn't they come to help him in his battle against the angel? And so we refrain from eating the sciatic nerve because we're ashamed of not having helped our father in this battle. Okay, Breshit Rabbah sees the yarech as a euphemism for genitalia and says that nagaba tzadikim uva tzadikot. Okay, in other words, when the angel dislocated the thigh, what he was doing is foretelling that Jacob's descendants will suffer many, many incidents throughout their history of persecution, of being killed, of being coerced into changing their religion and the like. Okay? So that's why we don't eat the Gid HaNasheh. And finally, I brought a passage from a book by Professor Yoni Grossman, book about the cycle of Jacob's stories, where he argues that what we are actually doing is celebrating a very paradoxical event. On the one hand, we see God face to face in this event. Yaakov sees the angel at eye level, wrestles with him. That's a direct encounter with the divine. And on the other hand, the divine has this power to just touch the thigh and miraculously dislocate it. And so that shows something very paradoxical. The meeting between us and God, okay, is a meeting that is
Fraught with danger.
on the one hand, it's fraught with danger because of our frailty, our weakness, the complete asymmetry. And on the other hand, God meets us on our own level, face to face. Both of these things are happening simultaneously. And so the Gid HaNasheh really celebrates the fact that we, frail beings, bounded by our physical limitations, are nevertheless able
To
to
meet with
ascend to a
God.
level where we can confront God. So by avoiding the Gid HaNasheh, it's like taking a certain part of the animal and sanctifying it. We're saying, God, we can't have the whole animal because this is your part. Okay, you gave us the rest of the animal to have. But the part that represents how the physical can ascend to the level of a spiritual encounter, that part we leave. That part we say, that's not ours. That's not ours. That's not ours to take. And if so, then based on this interpretation, I think we can take the laws of Gid HaNasheh and see them as fitting into the pattern that we've been looking at, right? The pattern of the sort of permeable boundary between the secular and the sacred. There is a boundary. The secular is not the sacred. But Tractate Hullin is all about the permeability of that boundary. And all of these three halachot represent that idea, as in fact does the law of Shchita itself, which took up the earlier chapters of Tractate Hullin. Okay, we'll close with that. And Shavua Tov
Great.
to all.
Beautiful. Thank you.
All right. Shavua Tov. We will be
Shavua
joining
Tov.
together one last time next week. And then we will switch to Bechorot. Just a programming note. Masachet Bechorot. The next Masachet will be a asynchronous class. Please keep an eye on drisha.org/classes within the coming 2 weeks for more details about what the next Masachet will look like. I hope to see you all next week. I hope to see some of you, any of you, all of you in the next Masachet. And take care.